My name is Peter Krishnan. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History and at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here again. If this is your first time with the Gotham Center, I invite you to learn more about our institution online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find hundreds of podcasts, recorded interviews, panel discussions, original essays, book reviews, and more on all things New York City history. Those of you looking for a deeper dive may also be interested in our new online education program, Gotham Ed. You can view past and forthcoming courses at gothamed.com. With that said, tonight we'll be discussing this fascinating new book from historian Donald F. Johnson and the University of Pennsylvania Press entitled Occupied America, British Military Rule and the Experience of Revolution. Historical research on the war that founded this country, that formally established the United States, is easily one of the largest bodies of knowledge within the field of US history, naturally. But as Johnson rightly notes in this book, the actual experience of those years for ordinary Americans remains frustratingly unclear, despite 2 centuries of research and debate. To a large extent, that's because the conflict has long been portrayed as a unified struggle by colonials with a relatively predetermined outcome, a romantic, high-minded David and Goliath tale, with the scrappy patriots taking on the most powerful empire in world history because they were inspired by new abstract ideas of republicanism and uniformly outraged by recent acts of imperial Britain. The effect of that simple, straightforward narrative has been to essentially depoliticize a more complicated story, papering over the many divides within and between the diverse populations in the colonies and suppressing the constant factor of historical contingency. By contrast, recent scholarship has argued that we should think of the American Revolution as instead the nation's first civil war, since the patriots are thought now to have commanded no more than maybe 40% of the country, with just as many people undecided or neutral, and the wealthiest 20%, fifth of the population, supporting the crown. These scholars have emphasized the indiscriminate violence of that struggle on both sides, arguably proportionally one of the deadliest conflicts in US history, as well as the influence of the long, brutal, and alienating years of British military occupation, which have normally been ancillary to headlines about the elite founders, diplomatic, military, and legislative wranglings. We're only still beginning to reconsider the war for independence. As we noted in the marketing for tonight's discussion, this book is really the first broad examination of what British military occupation did to shift majority opinion in the colonies against the crown. And Johnson emphasizes that opinion varied greatly from person to person and changed significantly over time. In cities like New York, tightly connected socially, economically, politically to the British Empire, occupation held the promise of restoring order and loyalty, a potentiality that both sides of the conflict recognized early on. But as the hopes for new opportunities descended into repression and violence, including harassment, robbery, assault, rape, even murder, the aggregate effect of British military rule, Johnson argues, was clear enough. By the end of the war, most people who lived under occupation had renounced loyalty to the king, and British authority itself had largely unraveled. In this way, one might conclude from this study that the British, in effect, defeated themselves by gradually losing the hearts and minds of a de facto majority opposed to or unaligned with the rebellion. This was a national story, of course, but no city suffered more or was more important to British victory than New York, the British military headquarters during the war and the seat of its loyalist base. So I will leave it to our speaker tonight to elaborate, but allow me first to briefly introduce him. Donald F. Johnson is Associate Professor of History at North Dakota State University, where he teaches courses on early America, memory studies, and historical research and writing. He earned his PhD from Northwestern University and has published essays in the Journal of American History and the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, as well as several book chapters and numerous reviews. He is the recipient as well of numerous fellowships and has claimed several awards for the book we'll be discussing tonight, including the Distinguished Book Award in U.S. Military History from the Society for Military History, distinction as a finalist for the Gilded Lambert Prize for Military History, and the Dissertation Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. He is currently also working on 2 more book projects, a study of local revolutionary organization between April 1775 and July 1776, those pivotal months before the war, and a larger history of the Continental Congress and its collective leadership during that conflict. I'm very happy to welcome him here to the Gotham Center. And I'm very happy as well that we could be joined tonight by our discussant, Brett Palfreman. Brett is Associate Professor of History at Wagner College in Staten Island, and the current Robert D. L. Gardner Writing Fellow here at the Gotham Center, where he is completing the first major book to examine the fate of the approximately 400,000 Loyalists who remained after the War for Independence. Like the story of British military occupation, the reintegration of the monarchist minority during the so-called critical period, those 4 years between the defeat of the British and the construction of the new American Republic, is a national story. But as the Gotham Center's director, I must add, of course, that no city, that New York was likewise the epicenter of this nationwide process of reintegration, with more supporters of the king on Long Island and in the 5 boroughs in Westchester than anywhere else in the country. Because of their sheer numbers, in fact, 1 in every 7 people by 1783, Brett will correct me if that's wrong, Loyalists even had a hand in reshaping and preserving the nation's legal and political institutions. So I think we are doubly blessed tonight in having 2 scholars in conversation. We're both doing truly pioneering research, which among other things highlights the unappreciated centrality of New York to the oft-told tale of America's founding. So I'm very pleased that he could join us as well. I'm going to turn it over to Don now, who is going to provide a brief overview of the book before Brett joins us in conversation. But first, the usual bit of housekeeping. As always, a discussion will last until about 7:30 or so, at which point we will take your questions. At any time during the next hour, you can use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to send in questions, and I encourage you to do so. We have disabled the chat function that will not be available to you out of respect to our speakers. We don't want to have distracting conversations. So with that, I've done my part. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed speakers with a bit of silent applause, and I will see you for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that that wonderful introduction, and I'd also like to thank the Gotham Center for this invitation, and all of you for giving up some time on a Monday evening to join us. And what I want to do kind of before we get into our discussion, and I'll be brief because I want to save time for this kind of discussion portion with Dr. Palfreman, is to give kind of a brief overview of some of the arguments and kind of what I see as the impact of occupied America of the book. And essentially what I'm trying to do in this text is to investigate the everyday experience of ordinary people living under military occupation during the Revolutionary War. And I focus really on day-to-day life in port cities occupied by the British Army, recounting how men and women from a variety of backgrounds, ethnicities, social classes, professions, etc., how these people navigated harsh conditions, mitigated threats to their families and livelihoods, took advantage of new opportunities, and often balanced precariously between revolutionary and British attempts to secure their allegiance. And the experiences of these people reveal a lot that we didn't already know about the revolution. They reveal that the process of political change during those years occurred not in a single instant for most people. Most people are not like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson, who have kind of an epiphany or kind of join the revolutionary cause early on. But rather, most people, this occurs gradually over the course of years of everyday hardships, slights, and disruptions, which force North Americans to grapple with their political allegiances in intensely personal and highly contingent ways. And we're not often used to thinking about the American Revolution as kind of a personal struggle, and it's kind of an outlier there. We think of the French, the Russian revolutions as revolutions that have a great kind of personal devastation impact on their populations, but we don't apply this lens to the American Revolution, which, or at least we haven't until fairly recently. And I argue in the book that the quotidian, the day-to-day experience of military occupation not only shows us a different angle of people's experiences, but also directly affected the outcome of the conflict. Between 1775 and 1783, every large North American port city fell under occupation by the British Army. And the six cities that I study in the book, Boston, New York, Newport, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, were the most populous cities in North America. They were also centers of commerce and politics. And so if there was anywhere that would have triggered kind of a counter-revolution, or from which the British could have sought to restore authority, it should have been these cities. And British officials, as I demonstrate in the early part of the book, were not ignorant of this potential. In each city, Army officers worked with prominent civilian loyalists to craft deliberate and efficient regimes, which were intended not only to keep the peace, but to entice Americans to return their allegiance to the crown. They also perpetrated an exceptional social atmosphere that provided avenues for many people, especially women and the enslaved, but also free men, to reinvent their lives under a new, different regime, but different both from the revolutionary regime and the kind of pre-revolutionary British regime. And although these dazzling new opportunities came with dire risks, military rule actually benefited thousands of people. However, occupation failed to bring out the hoped-for restoration of imperial authority. Despite the efficient civil military administrations that evolved and the new opportunities that this society promised, by the end of the war, the lived experience of military rule had weakened that authority to its breaking point. Survival under harsh material circumstances, brought on by the needs of an army that at times nearly doubled the civilian populations of these cities, along with refugees and other folks that came with that army, forced even the most loyal subjects residing in the occupied territories to turn to smuggling, begging, and other illicit means to feed and shelter themselves and their families. And to facilitate their material survival, those living in occupied cities learned by necessity to obfuscate their loyalties, taking advantage of the British military's offers of generosity to those who declared themselves loyal. And we can talk a little bit about the nature of allegiance and loyalism too in the interview and the Q&A, but also maintaining ties to revolutionary camps. And the necessity to evade imperial authority and preserve allegiances on both sides kind of steadily undermined the structures that the British Army was trying to build. So much so that in city after city, by the time the army withdrew, most residents, even many who had wholeheartedly supported the crown, no longer saw restored monarchical rule as a viable option. Thus, while Americans living under occupation did not rise up en masse and violently resist their oppressors, it would have been a much easier book to write had they done so. Their everyday experiences under military rule had a profound impact both on their own political beliefs and on the outcome of the Revolutionary War. So I think I'll end my little spiel there and turn it over to Brett.
Thanks, Don. Fantastic. And let me say that I'm glad it wasn't such an easy transition or a quick overnight transition, because we get to hear this much more interesting story from you. This is a really exciting book, and I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you a little bit about it. So let's start at the beginning. When the British show up in these occupied cities, in a city like New York, you argue, at least at the beginning, this creates a dazzling, I think was your term just now, a dazzling array of opportunities for various different categories of residents of these cities. How specifically, like what kinds of people are we talking about here? And how specifically could the arrival of an occupying force be a good thing for people?
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive in some ways. And there's three big groups that tend to benefit. And the first is mercantile classes, people who are engaged in whose livelihoods depended for the most part on transatlantic commerce in the era kind of before the imperial crisis, or before kind of the imperial crisis got so bad that we think about kind of embargoes and boycotts in 1774 and 1775. And when the British Army arrives, and especially kind of in New York, Newport, Rhode Island, and in Philadelphia, these people see kind of a way to reconnect to this kind of empire of goods, this kind of transatlantic system of commerce that had enriched so many people in the mid 18th century. And so what I found, is it's fascinating. You see kind of merchants and retailers, pretty much the day after British forces, take over. In some cases, in Newport, Rhode Island, I found a merchant who, literally like the evening that the British Army arrived in town, he starts writing to his suppliers in London saying like, okay, I'm back. We need more silver. We need more ceramics, send me, all these shipments and I'll sell them. So these people are really excited to kind of resurrect kind of moribund businesses. Other people that benefit are kind of folks who were a little bit less influential or a little bit disenfranchised under both the colonial and the revolutionary regime. One of these groups is actually female women business owners and married women, especially in a lot of these cities. One of the most fascinating accounts that I found in occupied New York was a landlady in the city who kind of played both sides. She rented out rooms in her house to both a few British officers, but mostly to American prisoners of war who had their parole. These kind of continental prisoners of war would pay her in continental hard currency, or continental paper currency, excuse me, which didn't really have much of a value in occupied New York. But because she was a woman and she was living on her own, she was able to frequently kind of get passes to cross through the lines. And so she would take that continental money, go over to New Jersey, where it was spendable, buy up essentially, as much produce as she could kind of on the cheap, and then return to New York City and sell that for gold and silver to grocers and marketers in the city. And she became quite wealthy doing this, and also ended up being able to kind of live separately from an abusive husband and kind of grow what became a large business. And then the third group that benefits the most here are African Americans, the enslaved, especially in the southern cities in Charleston and Savannah. But also in New York and in Philadelphia and even in Rhode Island, the British Army offers freedom to the enslaved people who belonged to patriot masters. Although kind of a lot of these folks end up being re-enslaved or abused by the army, thousands of them come to occupied cities, make new lives for themselves, and eventually kind of are carried off to freedom after the war. So yeah, I mean, there's some circumstances, right, where kind of a new regime, a new occupying force, which is trying to kind of change things and secure allegiances, can actually benefit, some of these marginalized groups.
Wow. So it definitely seems like the British are interested in helping out those who can help them, right? If you can provide a function to the British, if you can sell them some good, or come over to the British side, or deprive the patriots of something. Did the British have any mechanisms for determining who was who, like who was a worthy ally, who was loyal or allegiant enough?
Yeah, none that worked very well, but they certainly tried a lot. So in New York is a great example of this. In the fall of 1776, when Manhattan and Long Island and kind of the area around New York is conquered by the British, they go out and they distribute around 5,000 of these loyalty oaths, which are kind of printed little pieces of paper that civilians were to sign, declaring that they were 100% loyal to the crown, and that they abjure kind of all other authorities. So it's even kind of trying to get people who had, supported the revolutionary governments to return to their allegiance. And these were kind of passports. So there would be, 2 copies of these things. One of them was kept in a register that the British military headquarters in Manhattan. And the other ones were kind of given to the individuals. They could kind of show them, at checkpoints and at various places and say, look, here it is. Here, I'm a certified loyalist. But unfortunately, these things didn't work that well. It turns out, a lot of North Americans were willing to kind of sign this thing, but not necessarily agree or abide by it. And a lot of folks, and they realized this about 3-4 years into it, if not earlier, that a lot of folks who sign these loyalty oaths are still keeping their options open. They're still leaving New York or Charleston or Philadelphia to go outside the lines. They're still kind of keeping ties to the revolutionary forces. But yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of attempts to kind of define people, to pigeonhole people in the area by both sides. I mean, the revolutionaries are doing the same thing.
Absolutely. So we see these moments of tremendous, if precarious, opportunity for a whole variety of people at the beginning of occupations. Then things start to go somewhat wrong in city after city, as you argue. And I think it's hard for us to imagine the scale of time here. Like in New York City, we're talking about 7 years of occupation. That's a really long time. So what are like the big categories of things that start to go wrong in terms of the experience of occupied people, that eventually turns many, if not most of them, against the occupiers who they may have signed these loyalty oaths for from the very beginning?
Yeah. I mean, well, and I think you're right that there's several different kind of categories here, right? So the first is kind of materialist. It becomes, these places become really crowded, and it becomes really difficult to source or obtain kind of food, fuel, shelter, in some cases, the necessities of life. In Newport, Rhode Island, for example, like 10,000 troops show up at the end of 1776. And the town's population, pre-war population, is only about 15 to 20,000. So nearly, almost increases it by almost double. New York City, the army stationed is anywhere between 20 and 25,000 at certain points at its height, and dwarfs kind of the city's own population, and drives up kind of prices and supplies of everything. And you see like instances, especially kind of in the case of New York, it happens kind of gradually. Initially most people flee during or before the Battle of Long Island. There's only about 5,000 people in the city when the British arrive. But over the next few years, people start coming back and trying to move back into their old homes. They find them occupied or British soldiers residing in them. And the other thing to remember is that early modern armies, that they didn't travel with only soldiers. They brought soldiers' wives, children, a ton of kind of camp followers, merchants, and washerwomen, and servants, and all kinds of different people. So these when I say 10,000 soldiers, it's probably more like 12,000, 13,000 people when you count all of these other folks. And these are folks that are not necessarily provided for on the official military register. So even if the army is supposed to be providing rations and shelter to its own soldiers' wives and families are kind of fending for themselves, and oftentimes stealing and competing with locals. There's a great source that I used for New York, which was the daybook of one of the military commandants of the city, and it contains this kind of litany of complaints by civilians about what the soldiers are doing, and what's kind of going wrong. And one of the biggest things was that military families are kind of squatting in people's houses and in places that kind of they thought were not people who had been abandoned, or that they simply came in and kind of started living there without permission. And in other cases, these families kind of open up illicit rum shops. In Boston, for instance, there's a big rash of alcohol poisoning deaths from soldiers and civilians who get drunk off of kind of questionable rum that is sold by these soldiers' wives. So it becomes this kind of great just this drain on these cities' resources and populations. And the other aspect to that is just, at the time that the armies are there, right there, because early modern armies don't campaign in the winter generally, so they're kind of encamped in these cities over these winters. They're kind of stripping the landscape bare of food and fuel. Newport, Rhode Island, for example, sits on the southern end of Aquidneck Island in Narragansett Bay. And by the end of the first year of occupation there, they had cut down every single tree on the island, and were sending boats as far as Long Island to fetch wood. In New York, the Baroness von Riesdael, whose husband was a Hessian general, remarks that by the winter of 1779, 1780, a lot of people in the city were burning animal fat and kind of anything they could to survive, and that a cord of wood cost almost as much as a month's provisions or a month's food. So there's just a ton of deprivation, and
having experienced some winters in New York, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, imagine,
it's hard to imagine,
like kind of going through that without firewood.
I'd be pretty desperate. I might pay that month's salary for that cord.
So yeah, I mean, and so these people end up kind of undercutting British authority in order to get their needs met. They end up going outside of the lines. They end up stealing, smuggling. So that material aspect is the main kind of downside of a lot of these occupations. There's a couple of other levels as well. I mean, one of them has to do with the ways that the British actually exercise their authority. And it turns out that military officers, even with the best of intentions, don't make the best civil administrators. They come in and they want order, they want peace, they want to return people to kind of the king's peace or the king's authority, but they don't necessarily know the ins and outs of these places. And they really easily offend a lot of folks. One of the best examples of this is in Charleston, South Carolina. The British officers kind of tread this really tight rope between slavery and freedom for their enslaved allies. But at one point they host an event called the Ethiopian Ball, where the cream of the British officer corps dances the night away with formerly enslaved women of some of those prominent patriots in South Carolina. And this just utterly incenses even white loyalists who are seeing this kind of subversion or inversion of the racial hierarchy that South Carolina, Georgia, and many of the colonies existed under. In other places, it's kind of a mistreatment, attrition of mistreatment. One of the most prominent figures in the book, and I think one of the most interesting, is Tench Cox, who a lot of people who are familiar with this period will recognize the name as a member of the Treasury in the 1790s and 1800s. But he was a pretty devoted loyalist in 1776, 1777, 78. Actually operated a thriving mercantile business in occupied Philadelphia. But it was kind of death by 1,000 cuts for his loyalty. He found British officers, greedy, requiring bribes, oftentimes kind of would search his warehouse without permission and without kind of real cause. They stole his brother's house and furniture sets. And so by the end of the occupation of Philadelphia, he actually writes to a friend, I'm determined to become the perfect American. The British Army has mistreated me so much that I can no longer I renounce my loyalties. So kind of there's two levels there. One of them's kind of material. One of them's also kind of this kind of bad treatment by British military forces and kind of inept governance.
Yeah, and as I go on to discover in my own research about loyalists who then stay in the United States after the revolution, Tench Cox's sincere loyalism is not that much of an impediment to his political career in the independent United States afterwards.
Yeah, it's one of those things I often kind of think of it as like George Bush's draft dodging, right? Like it's kind of like it gets brought up sometimes, but no one really blames him for it.
That's a good analogy. Yeah. All right, so you're looking at 6 cities up and down the North Atlantic seaboard. I'm curious, is this pattern of a gradual rejection of British authority over time, is that pretty standard across these 6 cities? And then, since we are talking to the Gotham Center right now, does New York stand out in any way? Is it part of the pattern, or is there anything unique and distinct about the experience of New York that charts a different course from these other 5 or any of the other 5 cities?
So yeah, I mean, and in terms of New York, yes and no. So there is kind of some variation among the cities, but I think the processes of kind of material privation and mistreatment kind of hold true throughout. But the differences kind of tend to come in the timing of when things happen. So, for example, New York, Newport, Rhode Island, and Philadelphia tend to be fairly optimistic at the beginning, right? These are, the kind of the British Empire kind of returning for the first time in force to these major cities. A lot of people kind of have a lot of hopes pinned to this. But by the time the army gets to Savannah and to Charleston, 1779, 1780, people are a lot more jaded. There's a lot, they've seen what happened in Philadelphia and Rhode Island. And a lot of that has to do with how the British Army treats even the people who are loyal to it kind of when they leave. So in 1778, the British pull out of Philadelphia and Newport in kind of a tactical retreat. Has to do with kind of military strategy to reorient the war towards fighting the French in the Caribbean. And they kind of abandon the people who are most loyal to them. Going out of Philadelphia, several thousand people kind of leave when the British go. But they're impoverished, they're stuck. They have to kind of give up, a lot of what they had. And there's this kind of impermanence that's implied with a lot of this, right? Where if the British kind of, can come in and restore royal authority and get everyone ginned up to fight for the crown, what happens when they go and people lose everything? And I mean, this happens not only people who leave Philadelphia, but some people who stay. Two people are actually executed after the British leave Philadelphia for having served in the city watch under the British occupation. Grace Galloway, whose husband Joseph was a member of the First Continental Congress, who then kind of decided he could not forswear his loyalty to the king and became a loyalist, becomes kind of a functionary in the British occupation of Philadelphia, figures that, when the British leave, he can go to England, but leaves his wife in town. And her property ends up confiscated, and she actually ends up kind of living impoverished and dying about a year after the occupation in kind of a leaky cellar room of one of her friends. And so people see this elsewhere. They see that kind of the British Army doesn't always hold up its promises. It's really telling that far fewer people leave with the army from Newport than from Philadelphia, and far fewer sign loyalty oaths in Savannah and Charleston than in New York, for the possibility of this being kind of held against them. Now, the second part of your question was kind of, does this set New York apart, or what sets New York apart? And I think it's that what you alluded to earlier, that it's a 7-year occupation. It's the longest by far of any of these occupations. And New York is British military headquarters for most of the war. And as such, it gets this massive influx of refugees from other places, so much so that by 1781, 1782, most of the people living in New York City are not from there. They're loyalist refugees who have come from various other areas in British North America. And so there's a lot more, I don't know, it changes kind of the stakes of New York's occupation. It's also, one city that didn't necessarily want to be returned to the colonies. There's actually talk at the Paris Peace Conference of keeping New York and giving kind of the rest of North America to the United States. And we can imagine kind of New York as kind of an American Hong Kong, as this kind of British enclave in an independent America. So there's this influx, and it keeps the politics there, keep it much more kind of rigidly loyal, at least on the outset, than a lot of other places where loyalty was much more fungible.
So why cities? You point out early on that these 6 cities, Boston, New York, Newport, Philly, Charleston, and Savannah, contain less than 1% of the total population of the colonies at that point. So by our standards today, these are really towns, and probably even small towns. And yet these cities are at the center of your story, because you argue that they play an outsized role in determining the fate of the war and Americans' attitudes. Why are these cities so important?
So two reasons, and one of them is, as you suggest, the idea that these were the political and economic hubs of colonial America. All six of these cities were capitals of their respective colonies and provinces. And as such, they kind of play an outsized role even before the war in kind of governing and setting policy for the empire. They're also kind of beacons where people can flock to if they want to join the British cause. So, for example, the southern cities, Savannah and Charleston, become these massive hubs for escaped enslaved people, for these slaves kind of coming to join the British Army, coming to take advantage of the offers of freedom. And it's, we think of it as kind of, it maybe kind of, go a little bit unnoticed now, but it was important to have somewhere that you knew kind of the British Army was going to be, and to be consistently. There's large swaths of areas that the British Army claims to occupy, especially in the South and kind of the area around New York City, where you could go months or even years without seeing a single redcoat. But in kind of the occupied cities, it's that the army is there, and it's kind of where they're publicly making their stand. And the other aspect is that because of this kind of daily interactions, occupation is much more intense in cities than in the countryside. Being occupied in rural South Carolina might mean, seeing a British troop come through, once or twice over the course of 3 years. Whereas in Charleston, you're kind of living cheek by jowl with soldiers and their families and kind of the British military apparatus. And so for that reason, I think it has cities at least play an outsized role in the narrative of occupation, as well as in the larger kind of political narrative of the revolution.
All right, let's zoom out a little bit now. So once we understand this story, why does it matter? Like, what are the big insights that you're able to give by telling this story that's been little told before? And I'll start here. So the actual outcome of the war, is it important to the actual outcome of the war that so many city residents turned against British occupation over time within these cities?
I think it is. It's a complex kind of issue because you can look at it two ways. You can look at it as from a military standpoint, not necessarily, right? It doesn't really matter to Cornwallis at Yorktown that most, people in Charleston, South Carolina are now, by 1781, not loyal to the crown. The military campaigns kind of operate on their own steam. But what it does affect is the willingness of kind of the British ministries and the British government to actually continue to keep fighting. And to pose kind of a counterfactual, if we consider kind of after Yorktown, right, this battle in October of 1781 that for the most part decides the conflict in North America. If after Yorktown there had been an influx of new volunteers, right, or of kind of pro-royal feeling in these occupied territories, which the British were definitely trying to encourage, you wonder whether or not kind of they would have given up so quickly, whether or not, they would have tried to continue the fight. The idea of kind of popular support of kind of the failure to win hearts and minds, makes it so that the military conflict feels unsupported, right? And I mean, it's the kind of the observation that John Shai makes in the 70s, which I still think holds up, is if we're going to compare the War of the American Revolution to anything, it's kind of a British Vietnam, right? It's where they come in and attempt to win the hearts and minds of the population and to engage in this big counterinsurgency campaign, but they utterly fail, and as they campaign around the countryside, they alienate. And as I argue, as they occupy these cities, they alienate more and more people. So I think if we look at it strictly as a military conflict, it may have less of an impact. But I would argue that it has a huge impact in kind of the less tangible aspects of war. It has a huge impact in swaying the support of the population. And also opening up a large number of people's eyes to the possibility that there might not be a future with the British. Mm-hmm. And this is, again, something that we kind of overlook sometimes, right? That for almost everybody, the British monarchy and the constitutional system of the empire was the only government they had ever known. And most of them are raised to think it's the freest government in the history of the world. And so we think, from 250 years later, of course, like they all supported life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But a lot of folks, are like, what are you talking about? Like, we already live in the freest society in the world. And it takes kind of being occupied and oppressed in some ways by these folks to kind of change their minds.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's certainly something we see in American history and world history over and over again. The longer a war lasts, the harder it is to drum up support. And the longer a war lasts, the more you make new enemies out of people who wouldn't have been your enemies otherwise.
Absolutely. I mean, just the last, 20 years of American foreign policy has given us that.
For sure. How does the experience of occupation change people's behavior afterwards? I mean, do these residents of occupied America carry new attitudes or ideals or policies into the creation of the new nation after the war, that it affects the shape of the society that they create afterwards?
Yeah, I think yes and no. In terms of carrying new attitudes, you see in people's writings and in kind of people's explicit thoughts, this idea of kind of, we need to get on with everything. Right, we need to kind of forget this experience and kind of just move on with life, and even kind of, especially for former loyalists, there's a necessity to kind of hide former actions. Tench Cox, who I mentioned earlier, goes so far as to take a penknife and kind of hack apart his letter book from when he was doing business in occupied Philadelphia. And so if you go through kind of those papers at the Historical Society of Philadelphia or Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, there's all of these kind of little scratched out or cut out pieces. And so you see kind of this movement to kind of cover up a lot of the complexities, a lot of the intricacies. But I do think it leads to a more flexible way of looking at the world, at least for kind of those who experience occupation. And and I don't have, you probably know more about this than I do, but I think it also lends itself to kind of a spirit of forgiveness for a lot of people, who were loyalists or who did loyalist things during the war. This idea that, okay, we were all in this situation where we had to make hard choices. It wasn't pretty. We had, almost everybody living in these occupied cities had to compromise, their morality or their political beliefs or sometimes, even worse, to survive. And almost everybody had changes of heart and disillusionments, sometimes re-illusionments. And so I think they come out of this experience less kind of ideologically pure, or less kind of doctrinaire than they might have otherwise, and that you see in kind of other revolutionaries, right? And you see this kind of when the Continental Army comes into New York in November of '83, and they're kind of disgusted that all of these kind of like card-carrying loyalists are brazenly walking around and no one seems to care, and so there's I think it does kind of lead into this period that you write about the kind of reintegration.
We are so used to thinking about these characters as two ends of a spectrum, right? And principled patriots and principled loyalists, but your story of the day-to-day experience really makes clear that the muddled choices all across the middle of this spectrum, and the why you make the choice matters, and the when you make the choice matters. And I think there's definitely a contingent amongst the winners of the war who remember this and realize a lot of the stuff that we did, even we who think of ourselves as steadfast patriots, could be kind of questionable over the course of such a long war with shifting fortunes and changing material circumstances. A lot of people come out of this war thinking, what, maybe this is not so simple a story as patriot or loyalist.
Absolutely. Though, I mean, I will add that, and I touch on this kind of in the epilogue to the book, but Michael Haddam's work and other folks who work on memory have explored it more deeply, that there is a movement to kind of get rid of the complexities of the war, afterwards, to kind of lose that in the memory of the revolution.
I get it. I was going to ask. So if I buy that this is important, why don't we know the story already?
And a lot of it has to do with how kind of patriot historians and politicians chose to commemorate and interpret both their own experiences and the experiences of the country. I mean, it's one of the most quoted axioms on the Revolutionary War is John Adams, who in letters to a couple of his correspondents in the 18 teens writes, what do you mean about the revolution? Are you talking about the war? The revolution was completed before a drop of blood was spilled at Lexington and Concord. And so he's saying, basically the revolution occurs from 1765 to 1774, and that once the war happens, it's just a logical after effect of an already completed sea change in people's minds and hearts. And you see this also in a little bit more nuanced ways in some of the earliest histories of the war, even by people who should know better. So David Ramsey, the South Carolina doctor and Continental Army officer, eventually becomes a congressman, and in the 1790s writes these two kind of big influential histories of the revolution. And he himself was captured at the siege of Charleston and lived for a year in the occupied city. So he should have known kind of firsthand the complexities and kind of nuances of the situation, but he completely elides it. He writes in very stark terms about kind of these doctrinaire, kind of like you said, of a spectrum of kind of loyalists on one side, patriots on the other, and
what's the motive? What's the motive for that? Is that just a pleasing narrative of a revolution about freedom-loving patriots winning the chance to build a nation for themselves?
I think that and political power. Ramsey, it's not a coincidence that Ramsey is, a high federalist, that he's involved in kind of consolidating the United States under the Constitution in the 1790s and first decades of the 19th century. And so I think, he's writing this narrative in reaction, in some ways, I think it's also a reaction to the French Revolution. The idea that there wasn't kind of this brutality, this kind of awfulness in the American context, that the American Revolution was somehow purer than the French Revolution, which involved, much more public kind of flipping and flopping than the American Revolution. But I think it is in one sense it's political and it's reactive, but in the other sense I also think it does, these narratives kind of do allow for some forgiveness and some reintegration, because they kind of provide narratives that allow former loyalists to kind of cling on to something. Right. So I mean, Ramsey kind of explains away all the people who signed loyalty oaths in South Carolina by saying, oh, they weren't loyalists. They were forced to do it at gunpoint, or they said they'd lose their home. That was the oppressive British who made them do it. Mercy Otis Warren, another one of these historians, really interesting in her book in 1805. She talks a lot about kind of the villainy of loyalists, but she only names like half a dozen. Yeah. And so, it
Hutchinson, Arnold, like the big.
Yeah, the Allen brothers, like, and most of these people are already gone or dead. So it kind of gives this space for the people who are still there to kind of conform to a new narrative.
Yeah, as always, forgiveness requires a little bit of forgetting.
Exactly.
So one final question in our last couple minutes here before we open things up to the Q&A. Let's zoom out even more. Now, I'm happy to see that even as a revolutionary historian, you're thinking big in this book and thinking beyond the American revolutions for general implications. So in your opinion thus far, is it just kind of a general rule that occupations never really go well? I mean, the US conquered Iraqi territory fairly quickly in 2003, but the real problem was trying to win and keep hearts and minds over the next 15 years of occupation. We see right now, resistance in Ukraine getting stiffer seemingly by the day. Is it just a historical truism that sending in military occupiers turns local populations into enemies? Or is the story of the revolution distinctive in some way here?
I think, again, and not to be too cute, but I think a little bit of both. It's on the one hand, yes, it's militaries are not a great tool for winning hearts and minds. It's one of those things that just kind of holds up, that people who are trained to kill and whose job it is to go out and defeat the enemy as quickly as possible are usually not the best diplomats and not the best kind of at crafting civic policies and things that could actually work. I think, the where it gets a little muddy is when you define kind of a foreign military occupation versus kind of a domestic one, or a military occupation between different groups, right? So we look at kind of the United States and Iraq or Afghanistan or Russia in parts of Ukraine. And that's clearly like two different cultures, right? Or two different groups, one of them imposing its will on another. Whereas if you look at kind of more, and I won't say successful, but more kind of sympathetic military occupations, I would look at maybe, the post-Civil War South, right? Where it was the military occupation that allowed for many of the gains in civil rights and civil governance that occurred during Reconstruction, right? And it was
which quickly evaporated as soon as the army left.
Exactly, as soon as the troops left. And we can also think of this, right? And it's something that we don't often think of, but in the 1960s, right, in 1968, 69, 1970, a lot of American cities were under National Guard occupation, and again, that was not necessarily a bad thing. It was there were rioters, there was kind of a need to keep order. So I don't want to kind of overgeneralize, but I think in some of these instances, if it comes from kind of and again, this kind of gets back to the weird paradox of the revolution, and that the British are a foreign occupied force and they aren't. Right. Some people are expecting them to come back and kind of restore the status quo, antebellum. And some people are seeing them as kind of a foreign army. And even in the British Army, there's that same kind of debate, or that same kind of spectrum. You have some officers who are saying, the Americans are our brothers, we should treat them like any other British subject. And some saying, no, they're rebels, we should ground them into our boots.
Yeah. So it seems like an occupying force is a blunt tool, but like any tool, it depends on how you use it.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, obviously we're historians, so we're going to say depends on context as well.
Of course. All right. At this point, I'm going to invite Peter back to help us MC some of the questions coming in from the audience.
And they are streaming in by the dozens. And I invite you all to send in questions. Let's see how many of these we can get to before we call it an evening. I'm also pleased to see as we reminded, as always, the literacy of our followers here. So let's dispatch one of the big questions that come in from Elaine and Jay Sims. The fire. New York sees a terrible fire right after the Battle of Long Island, sometimes called the Battle of Brooklyn or the Battle of New York. At the outset of the war, destroys a third of the housing in the city. This is right before we see this massive influx of refugees and things like that. So the question, of course, obviously is, how badly does that affect the British ability to administer the occupied city?
It's a pretty big handicap. On the one, it does two things. And actually, Ben Karp at Brooklyn Colleges has a book coming out on this. I think at the end of the year. So
we will be featuring at the Gotham Center. Yes.
Yeah, I'll be able to read. He's the go-to expert on this. But in terms of the occupation, counterintuitively, it actually binds a lot of the community to the British Army really early on. The revolutionaries kind of take the blame for this. And I'll let Karp can weigh in on whether or not that's right or not. But the narrative is that Washington orders the city burned and leaves these saboteurs back
which he does ask of Congress. Correct?
Right. Yeah. And there's even this kind of conspiracy theory that it's Black people that are or free Blacks that are doing this.
Right.
And so for a lot of like the citizens remaining in New York, the British Army are the ones putting out the fires. They're the ones kind of trying to restore order, and it kind of binds the population there. But that being said, it also makes the situation really, really dire. I mean, it occurs, in the late fall, kind of going into a really harsh winter.
Horrible winter.
You've got people living in tents and kind of in burned out kind of shells of buildings. It really exacerbates kind of material shortages and things like that. And it takes them several years to kind of rebuild the city. It also creates some kind of really weird optics. One of the most interesting things I found in my research is that apparently the burned out ruins of Trinity Church were a promenade ground for wealthy British officers and their kind of American girlfriends. And this, creates, what's that?
Yeah. The so-called holy ground.
Yeah, and this creates kind of a huge backlash by folks who are like, hey, you're using, one of our great monuments here for to um well, for carnal pleasures.
Yes.
So yeah, the fire has some really interesting kind of side effects, and not always what you would expect.
So several of the questions touch on the other big feature in New York City, which is question of POWs, sometimes called the nation's first POWs, are largely headquartered in New York City on the prison ships. Those of you who have been to the Fort Greene Monument in Brooklyn, well, that's the tall column at the top of the hill is a memorial dedicated to those POWs. Nat Johnson asks, does the British Army engage in any mass killing of civilians, Black or ethnic whites, or prisoners of war? So I've sort of answered the question in part there, but we have several people asking about the effect of the treatment of POWs on public opinion. And maybe you want to answer separately this question of whether there were mass killings.
Yeah, in terms of mass killings, not official. I mean, not kind of in the sense of what we're seeing in Ukraine right now, right? Like not in the sense of kind of outright murders of civilians. Those are really rare, and actually, going through British court-martial records, pretty heavily punished. So like there's not this kind of mass killings, at least, or mass murder. There is, however, mass death, and it comes through starvation. It comes through deprivation. My colleague Cole Jones, in his book about prisoners of war in the Revolution, has estimated that half to 2/3 of the folks who get on these prison ships don't get off, right? Or in New York, it's also the Sugar House and a few other jails. The conditions are just so bad. They're not well fed, they're not well clothed. Part of this has to do with the idea of whether or not they're rebels, or who are subject to some summary justice, or actual prisoners of war. Treatment gets a little bit better actually after the Americans score a few victories. So, for example, after Trenton, where Washington gets several thousand prisoners of his own, suddenly they start feeding the Continental troops in New York a little bit better. But I mean, these, and I don't know whether to call what happens on these prison ships or in these prisons mass murder or not. It's certainly something that people knew about, and knew what was going on. It's also something that the British could hold over civilians. And we see kind of in Newport, in New York, and to some degree in Charleston, the idea that if civilians are getting out of line, or if people are refusing to go along with the program, they could be picked up and sent to one of these places. So it's it creates this kind of atmosphere of fear. There's one account in New York of actually when the loyalist Hector St. John de Crevecoeur comes to town in I think 1779 or 1780. He's initially imprisoned, mostly because there's false reports about him being a French spy. And he luckily had a couple of kind of high-placed friends among New York's loyalist community who were able to vouch for him. But he ends up kind of spending about a week in jail, along with many kind of Continental POWs.
Yeah.
So
we have a question. We have a question from Robert Isaac, whether there are any TV programs or movies that are accurate in portraying this story. And we get a sense of that in Turn, the series on the loyalists on Long Island. I don't know if you want to comment more on that, but I'm going to piggyback on that and take up Robert Wong's question, which is, I think, somewhat related here. And the question is whether or not the subversion of local political authorities, he says local political government, but this is martial law, right? So whether that incenses the local politicians and contributes to the gradual rejection of British occupation.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You know, the place that you see that most clearly, I think in New York and in Charleston, South Carolina, because it's not the high-placed loyalist civilians that the British Army goes to help them govern. It tends to be kind of lower level officials who have connections to the British Army or some kind of an in. So in New York City, for example, the highest placed civilian in the British regime is Andrew Elliott, who prior to the war was a tax collector, a customs collector. So they skip over kind of the old colonial governor who becomes a military general. They skip over much of the old hierarchy and kind of appoint these lesser people. And you see a lot of kind of these wealthy loyalists, you know, people like William Smith Jr., Cadwallader Colden, even William Franklin, who spends a lot of the war in New York, kind of constantly complaining about this, right? They're writing to their friends in the British government saying, you know, why don't you restore our colonial charters? Why don't you, you know, bring back this old system? And the generals keep saying, well, we'll win the war first, and then we'll bring back the charters, and then we'll bring back all this other stuff. And in South Carolina, it's even a little starker because a lot of the former officials show up after the city's taken, you know, expecting to get their jobs back, and they're kind of refused. Again, it's James Simpson, who was a former assistant attorney general, who ends up heading the occupation government, and he, like, you know, turns the lieutenant governor and you know, some judges and other folks kind of away. So absolutely, there is kind of a displacement.
And what's fueling that? Is it the sense that you know, you weren't able to keep these folks in line, so we're going to sort of use our own people, or what is do you have a sense for the British mentality?
There's some of that. There's also a lot of it is that. A lot of it is kind of, you know, you failed, essentially. A lot of it's also kind of military culture versus kind of the bureaucratic culture, and a lot of it has to do with kind of 18th century British political maneuvering. You know, once the army comes in, it's a whole different set of power relations and a whole different set of patronage and a whole different set of priorities.
Right.
So, you know, a lot of the colonial governors, right, held their positions because of whose interests they had and you know, who they knew. And those connections are not the same as those under kind of these various generals that get put in charge and kind of put their own people in place.
I'm going to pivot here and pose this question to both of you, from John Allen and some others. Want to know more about the urban versus rural divide in terms of loyalism. Yeah,
I mean, is there any like just how many loyalists were in cities versus in the country, or
a general sense of whether there are meaningful distinctions between the two?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I feel like in rural areas, people didn't have to necessarily be as overt with their allegiance. Yeah. So, you know, in again, kind of in cities, there's daily contact, and so you can kind of get a lot more sense of you know, how people are viewing things. Whereas in rural areas, you know, again, you might see some soldiers, you know, once or twice during the whole war. And so there's a lot less kind of necessity of declaring a position. I don't know, Brett, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. That's an really interesting way to break things down. I'm trying to decide if there's any real differences in treatments between urban loyalists and rural loyalists after the war. I would say that, so one of the main factors that affected a loyalist's ability to reintegrate, to stay in the States after the war, is personal connections and reputation. And in a bigger city, I mean, so many loyalists just move to a new area. Like their best option is to just go where no one knows your history. Go to a place where nobody knows your name. And perhaps that's easier for some people in bigger cities, although even these cities are still relatively small by our standards. But it is possible for, somebody from a farmer from Queens, maybe, to move to Staten Island or something like that. Whereas in a smaller town, out on the New York frontier, especially in places where the fighting was very violent and in often cases relatively recent to the end of the war, loyalists from there who wanted a new shot had to move further away from their hometowns in order to find a place where people didn't understand or remember their histories.
I think this addresses one of the other questions we have from Rosemary Nichols, who writes that one of the themes that runs through landowning families in the Hudson Valley was a sense that to maximize survival after the war, one or more members of the family would support the rebellion while others would be loyalists in a somewhat more cynical sense. This was asking to the extent to which this is going on in New York City, which I think we've also addressed. We have another question here about evacuation before the invasion. Did your research uncover any insight as to what made residents decide to stay or what inspired them to return? Was it purely economic or were there other factors?
A mix of factors, I think. A lot of people, first of all, most of the people who stayed were either in kind of industries that expected to become profitable again, so merchants and these other folks, or were kind of the hardcore loyalists, this kind of minority of loyalists who are, really ideologically committed and unable to be turned, or unable to kind of, not flexible in their allegiances, which I think is, a small minority of people, but one that does exist. So I think those are the people who stayed, and mostly, even within that group, there's a number that kind of leave temporarily. That kind of their idea is they're going to wait out the battle and come back. Regardless of which side wins, their plan is to come back. And I think we see this in a lot of warfare, right? That people don't want to be there when the cannonballs are coming down.
Well, I'll just interrupt to say, this is what, the largest naval invasion in history at that point.
Yeah. I mean, and someone, there's a contemporary who sees the fleet coming in the Hudson and says, it looks like all London is afloat, right? And just kind of like ships as far as one could see to the horizon.
And we do see a big return of former inhabitants to the city, right? Those 20,000 that leave, a lot of them do come back.
Yeah.
After, in the critical period, right? After the British leave.
Yeah, or even before the British leave. I mean, there's a fascinating period kind of while the peace negotiations are going on, where you kind of have negotiations between two competing authorities, and you can see kind of some loyalists, trying to sell their property or make arrangements for the future. There's this, so it's 1782 kind of when it's known that the United States will be recognized as an independent country, and that New York will likely be part of it. You see kind of all of these kind of merchants and landowners and folks kind of coming into the city and offering those people who kind of can't return, the people who kind of, will have to go into exile for having kind of committed egregious kind of crimes against the revolution or being seen as too loyalist even to rehabilitate. They're offering them kind of good deals on their houses or their livestock or their books. I have one letter one person who writes to her son, who's a law student, that she was able to get Joseph Galloway's entire set of law books for super cheap because he's couldn't take him with them on the ship. So there's this weird period where people are coming back into the city, and some loyalists are also trying to kind of make the best deal they can with the revolutionaries at that point.
I think this is a good segue to some of the other, I'm going to combine a couple of other questions here, but several folks are asking about the treatment of loyalists after the war, and Ann Haddad writes, since many were living cheek by jowl, her question is, how often do personal relationships between colonists and loyalists and the British, sometimes maybe even romantic relationships, occur, and what was the punishment for them after the war? I think this is a question both of you could sort of field here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk during the war. It was extremely common. I mean, there's a definite kind of a couple tiers of it. You see at the high end of the social spectrum, wealthy British officers courting kind of the elite kind of American women. But then, on the lower end, you could look through church registers, you look through kind of baptism records, and I was able to do that in Newport and Charleston. And there's dozens of babies born where the father is listed as a member of the British Officer Corps or a member of the British Army, and the mother is a local, and not always married, right? And in some cases, in some cases they kind of make the best of it. You see kind of in some circumstances, the new mother and child kind of traveling with the army or leaving with the army. In other cases, they're abandoned. There's a woman in Rhode Island whose name escapes me at the moment. It's been a long day, but whose husband, who's the purser of a British warship, just leaves as soon as the British evacuate, and she's kind of left on her own, and her family kind of doesn't take her back in, and she writes kind of this sad memorial to the British governor of New York when she shows up there to try to get some kind of recompense from the British government. But yeah, I mean, you see kind of people put in all sorts of different positions. Anyway, I'll let Brett talk about what happens after the war.
I see an opportunity for another Romeo and Juliet knockoff here. Star-crossed lovers, historical fiction. Yeah, so I mean, it's a perfect tie-in, and congrats to Peter for seeing the opportunity here for two projects pasted together that could be one longer story. But yeah, after the war, the energy in New York is all about punishing loyalists. It's about trying to identify the enemies of the state, essentially, as the victors see it. And in 1784, New York takes all kinds of measures to do this. The most significant being a 1784 Disenfranchisement Act, naming various categories of essentially criminal loyalists and then denying them the right to vote or hold office in New York City. But like Don, over the course of several years, I also see a gradual shift from a plan of exclusion, keeping loyalists out, denying them the rights to enter into the new political bodies of the states, slowly transitioning into forgiveness, into reintegration over the course of 5 or 7 years. The vast majority of loyalists who remained in the states, and many who came back from exile after a short period abroad, exercised the same rights and privileges as other Americans. And there's many reasons why, which I go into great detail discussing in my project. But the main one, and I think the most interesting one here in New York, is that New Yorkers figure out that there's just no good way to figure out who was a loyalist during the war, how exactly exactly loyalist one needs to be to qualify for punishment after the fact. And basically, as a matter of a kind of process and procedure, they learn in trying to punish loyalists that there is no good way to figure out who's a loyalist and what punishment they deserve. So after a few years, they default to the position of, let's just rely on reintegration.
We've been talking a lot about the US perspective on this. Robert Wong wants to know if you looked at the British perspective, that is on the failure or success of occupation. How did, say, Howe or Clinton think about the occupation of New York City or other cities?
Yeah, I mean, the British, I have a chapter about this in the book, and the British kind of thought of these places as the best hope for reconciliation. And you actually get some indication that at least for the Howe brothers, the idea was to kind of make these cities into a symbol of what a restored British Empire could look like. And the best example of this is Philadelphia. Howe takes this in kind of an unnecessary military campaign in 1777. Everyone else says, we should attack in, New York and cut off the New England from the rest of the colonies. Howe says, all right, you guys go do that. I'm going to take most of the army and invade Philadelphia. And it has military ramifications that people have talked about. But his idea here isn't just to kind of hold a strategic place, but to kind of create a beacon for loyalists, for potential loyalists, for people who are disillusioned with the revolutionary government to come and to kind of join in and see kind of what a new settlement could look like. And more, I think that's kind of the agenda of the British, at least kind of in that kind of middle period of the war, is to kind of convince as many Americans as possible to return to their loyalties. It's one of the reasons that kind of the Howe brothers entertain so lavishly in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. It's one of the reasons that Howe doesn't attack Washington, who's like 30 miles away at Valley Forge in a horrible situation, whereas Howe has one of the best armies in the world stationed in Philly. But I think, it's this kind of idea that the occupied territories could be areas that they could demonstrate kind of their leniency and the potential of kind of a new order going forward. And then that failure kind of comes as a bit of a shock, kind of at least to a lot of these officers that aren't involved with the day-to-day and aren't seeing kind of the problems in their efforts.
We have literally, I think, 2 minutes left in the promised window of time here. So I'm thinking we're not going to be able to get to all these questions, unfortunately. Thank you all for sending those in. I think I'm going to end with the question that Santa Croce writes from London, which is, if there's one thing that you hope readers will take away from the book, what is that?
I think that the revolution was, a complex experience. That the revolution was not just kind of a political shift or reorientation or an embrace of the Enlightenment or all of these other things, which it also was, but that it was a really traumatic and devastating experience for a lot of people living in British North America, that, through, 8 years of war and an additional kind of 10 years before of crisis and 10 years afterwards of kind of instability, people's lives are fundamentally changed and fundamentally threatened, and people are making decisions based on survival, and it's something that we think about in popular interpretations of the French Revolution, of the Russian Revolution, of these other major world revolutions, but we don't tend to think about that when we look at at the American examples. So that's kind of, what I think, is most important to kind of take away. It's one of the things that, I devote a lot of time to trying to parse out.
Well, I agree. And the Gotham Center is trying to do its part with its own projects in advance of the 250th anniversary of the revolution and restore some of that lost memory. Don, I want to congratulate you on what is a really fantastic book. I meant what I said at the beginning. Very exciting pioneering research that the both of you are doing. And Brett, thank you for your thoughtful questions. I want to thank all of you for tuning in tonight. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I hope you all will come back and join us Monday, April 18th, when we'll be talking with David Gelman and David Wallstreicher about Gelman's new book on the Jay family and their history with slavery. This event was recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel soon. We will be emailing that to everyone who registered. I want to thank the two of you again for a wonderful discussion. I could have easily gone for another hour or two, but we have to call it a night so people can relax. So Don, I hope to see you again sometime, and Brett, I will see you at the office.
Thank you all so much, Peter and Brett both, and for everyone who stuck with us for an hour and a half here.
Yes. Thank you all.
Congratulations, Tom.
Yes. Great book. Please go out. The code is in the, you can email the Gotham Center if you'd like the code for the discount for the book. I encourage you all to go out and buy it. Enjoy your night.